more interested in the applied aspect of things. But, I just took a few years off, worked in education and international development for a while.
What is the most critical period when children start learning language?
The brain is very plastic. There's very high neuroplasticity in those first few years. What kind of conversations are they having with these caretakers or caregivers?
The mom only speaks in English and the dad only speaks in French to the child. Is that beneficial?
You're only talking to your child like X number of hours per day.
With these things, we can't have it being prescriptive because perhaps
kids, I think, are pretty good at this.
In this episode of From Birth to Bloom, I'm so excited to bring to you someone whose work in the space of early childhood actually goes beyond research and academia into impacting lives worldwide. Sandra Georges El Hadi. Sandra is currently pursuing her PhD in human development at Harvard University, where she's also completed her master's in international education. Her research is driven by a deep curiosity of understanding how young minds learn languages, how they interact with the world around them, and how they learn to communicate better. She's also deeply fascinated by the role and the nurturing care that caregivers provide and how this care can impact children. It's a really interesting podcast because these conversations are something which most parents have a worry about. They want to know how their child can learn better, how their child can speak better. So all of this is exactly what Sandra is working towards. Join me in welcoming Sandra to this podcast because it's such an interesting one. Thank you so much for your time, and I think I'm really excited about this one because the field of language acquisition is something which I'm so curious about as well as so intrigued by, because I think this is the only time it happens in childhood when kids learn so many new words in such a short span of time.
Indeed. First of all, thank you for having me. And second, I definitely agree. I'm biased because this is my research area, but it is definitely super fascinating how quickly children learn language at a very young age and how efficiently they do that.
Absolutely. And just before we begin the language bit, what drew you to the field of children?
Okay, it was very circuitous actually for me. My undergrad was actually in political science, so it had nothing. I did political science and English as an undergrad, nothing to do with this. But I took a course on the politics of language and then another course on sociolinguistics, and then one thing led to another, and I was really interested in that. Ended up doing a master's in theoretical linguistics and comparative philology at Oxford. And from there, I was like, I'm more interested in the applied aspect of things. But, I just took a few years off, worked in education and international development for a while, then applied for my PhD. And initially, I wanted to do something a little more related to teaching foreign languages in schools, right? But then I realized, I'm so fascinated by how babies' brains develop and how language acquisition is just so immensely impressive at that age that I kind of pivoted. And now I'm here.
It's amazing.
And this is my 5th year, so.
Absolutely. And what a winding path, but so interconnected in its own right.
It makes sense in a way,
right? Exactly.
When looking backwards, I'm like, no, it's actually like one thing fed into the other, so it was fine.
Exactly.
It was informative.
So in your view, what is the most critical period when children start learning language? We know that babies do have that tendency to pick up on language a lot more than adults, for example. But is there a particular set of years which are extremely crucial?
So obviously I'd say even right from the first few months, right, it's super important to expose children to language. In fact, as of 12 months or so of age, children become less attuned to the different sounds in other languages and become more of experts in their own languages, phonological systems. So the earlier you're exposing your children to language and the more you're talking to them, the better. There isn't exactly one day where you're now you're 3 years old, you can't learn language anymore or whatever. But I think the sooner you start, the better, especially because we know that the brain is very plastic. There's very high neuroplasticity in those first few years. It doesn't mean that the brain is not going to learn other things when you're older, because the neuroplasticity is not something that ends at age 5 and you're done and then that's all you can learn. You can always learn, of course. But I think the ways in which you can and the efficiency that you can absorb new information with is definitely at its highest in those first few years.
It was really interesting to hear that it's in the first 12 months, the babies decide pretty much what's important to them.
Yes.
So when they're growing up in a multilingual environment, is it better to start feeding them different languages at an earlier stage?
Yeah.
Do they get confused by like hearing all these different languages around them?
That's a great question. I think there is this misconception that like growing up bilingual can confuse children, but it's actually not true. Children know very well like what the languages are that they're speaking, and they also know they're really good at identifying like which speakers can speak which language.
Oh,
so
wow,
for example, if they know that their grandparents can only speak French, for example, and cannot speak English, they're going to speak to their grandparents in French, but then to their mom in English if their mom is like an English speaker. So it's not really confusing. I think one of the reasons people like tend to have this misconception is because we find that there is sometimes a little bit of like a lexical lag if you look at their vocabulary development in one language, right? But when we look at both languages combined, we find that they're on par with monolingual kids, and that they catch up pretty quickly. It's just that you kind of have to do double the work, right? When you're I grew up bilingual myself, and I think, think about it this way. If you're a little kid and you're learning just English, then all you need to learn is to say, like, this is a dog, right? But if you're learning English and French, then you're learning to say, this is a dog, c'est un chien. And you're also, so you're learning 3 words in each, right? And then you're also learning the syntactic structure and so on and so forth. So there's a lot more work to do. So of course it's going to take a little longer for you to get the nuances of both. But I don't know, I'm very pro.
Absolutely. I grew up bilingual too. So I can completely understand the fact that like sometimes you tend to just converse in one language so much more. Whereas you know the other language, but you just tend to keep going back to like maybe your mother tongue, for example, until you go to school and like English is enforced upon that you have to now start speaking in English. You know the words about it, but you just find it more comfortable to like perhaps talk in English.
Right, and you might be like more comfortable speaking certain languages in different settings, right? Like there's a famous, now it's slipping I think it's Jean who said it, but there's a saying that like a bilingual is not 2 monolinguals in one, right? So like it's not like if you grow up bilingual in like English and French, it doesn't mean that you're exactly like someone who grew up fully monolingual in English and fully monolingual in French, and you combine these together and there you go, that's your language, right? It's very different, and I think language trajectories look different with different people, and you might use the languages in different contexts. So it might feel more natural to you, Michelle, to maybe use English when you're working here, like at the Chan school or whatever, you're speaking English, it might come to you more quickly than whatever language you use at home when you're communicating with your parents about something more emotional. So I think,
That's so true.
So it's like a tool. It's like a toolbox, and you draw on whatever language you feel most comfortable with.
That's so true. And in your experience, or maybe you've like come across this through your work, do you feel like children tend to think a little bit better if they have also learned their mother tongue? And the reason I ask this is because suddenly there's this shift, especially in like countries like India, to focus a lot on English and completely kind of sidetrack the mother tongue. All the attention, even in schools, is given to English. Do you think that children tend to think a little bit better though when they're also taught their mother tongue?
Yeah, so I think it's this is really interesting. I think I'm personally very all for making sure that children get to maintain whatever their heritage language is or whatever their home language is, essentially, in addition to whatever the school language is or the language of education is. There is such a thing. There's a lot of research on what they call like subtractive bilingualism, where like when you go to school, you're kind of expected to sort of let go of your home language and just learn this dominant societal language. And I think that's a bit problematic because you're missing out on a very important, it's an asset to speak multiple languages, right? It's an asset. And this is like, you're seeing, what Ruiz would call like seeing like bilingualism as a problem, right? Rather than thinking of it as a resource. And B, I think children, especially when they're very, very young, we know that they do better when they're learning in their mother tongue, they're a language that they feel comfortable speaking, right? Like if you're in class and you're not really understanding what's going on, it's not as fun as well, right? You want it to feel like something that you can relate to. You want to feel like it's something you understand. You're not the only kid in class who's like, what is going on here? So I think it's important to kind of, yes, I understand that they should definitely try to develop, the language of education, because you need that for academic achievement later on for whatever reason.
Absolutely.
But I also think it's a bit dangerous when we assume that, in order to succeed in one language, you need to let go of the other. I think they can go hand in hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about the home environment, there's an increased surge in how many parents are working now, and both mothers and fathers usually are working. In that kind of an environment, kids are perhaps lesser exposed to so much language communication that perhaps children before were exposed to. That constant back and forth of communication.
Mm-hmm.
We do recognize that through the servant return theory and all of that, that children learn better when it's like almost like a two-way street. They have to have that give and take of language.
Absolutely.
How do you foster a good home learning environment in this case?
Yeah. So I think obviously, like what you said, these servant return interactions, like conversational turn taking, is really important. Ensuring that there's like socially contingent responses, right? Like, so when this child is saying something, you're applying to them, you're talking with them rather than just like at them, right? You're like engaging in conversations with them, you're asking them questions. That's all very important, but I think your question is more like, okay, there's only so much time. Like, we're constrained in terms of how much time we can spend with our kids. So how can we make the most out of that? And I would say is just try to make these interactions meaningful, right? Try to maybe, like a little story time before bed, like some book sharing, or maybe even if you're doing something else, like you're cooking, you can turn that into an activity, and make it something like turn it into an opportunity to engage in like rich conversations. You could like label the things that you're using to cook. You could explain what you're doing to your child. You could ask your child what they find interesting about the process. Like, there are so many ways in which you can engage your children in conversations that are linguistically rich, but also interesting to them, right? Because at the end of the day, you're a mom or a dad, or you're a parent. So it's not just about this like the didactic aspect of like teaching language to your child. There's also this like element of social emotional learning that's going on. There's attachment. There's So I think just make it enjoyable in whatever little nuggets of little spaces of time that you can allow for it.
Absolutely. And another like second to this question is that since kids are spending more time perhaps away from their parents, maybe at a daycare center, maybe with a nanny, how do we understand how the literacy of the person they're spending the most time with impacts their learning of language?
Yeah, so obviously that is important, right? Because it's interesting you say this, because before, a lot of research used to just look at mother-related factors as like the main predictors, right? So like the mother's level of education, whether the mother is like loquacious and talks a lot or not, and so things like this. And I think that, we're going to see increasingly like a trend towards looking at other like pedagogical agents in the child's life, because children are indeed spending more time in like daycares and so forth. So it is incredibly important, right, to think of like what kind of conversations are they having with these caretakers or caregivers. And so, looking at, are the caregivers talking to the child? Are they engaging in things that we know foster like literacy development? Do they have the time to like read books to the child? And things like this, because obviously if you're at a daycare, you're not just taking care of one or two children. There's multiple children, so you have to like. So I think that is definitely still an important factor, and I think we're probably going to see a lot more research in that direction in the future.
And do we know if like kids learn very well from each other at such a young age? Do they like? I can imagine at a daycare there's like 5 kids talking to each other, but they aren't necessarily all making a lot of sense. Maybe they're just babbling at each other. But do kids really pick up on language through pure interaction at young age?
They can. I mean, they definitely can. There's it's interesting you say this. There's the Vygotskian theory, right, of like social interaction and learning through social interaction, which is basically essentially you think of children, they can learn from each other. This what Vygotsky calls like a more knowledgeable other. It could be an adult, right? And more like often it is an adult, right? It's your mom or your whatever, but it can also just be an older sibling or another peer who knows how to do something that you don't know how to do for whatever reason. And then they pick up these things from each other. And I think the biggest evidence of that is that sometimes kids come home and they're saying words that the parents never say at home. And they just learned it from their peers, right? And I think that's a good way to kind of control for who's teaching the kid, where the kid's like getting their language development from. So yes, they can definitely learn from each other, I would say. And you see that also with like siblings, right? So like research on siblings. But there's definitely something to be said about the role that parents can play in language development, because, you can be more intentional about it. You are also definitely the more knowledgeable other. There's no, you can be more almost like pedagogical about it in a way.
And when there are like 2 parents, for example, when the child is exposed to a mother and a father, and they want their kid to perhaps grow up bilingual or multilingual, is it useful if like one parent adopts just one language to talk to the kid in?
Yeah.
Like for example, the mom only speaks in English and the dad only speaks in French
Yeah.
to the child. Is that beneficial? Is a mix beneficial?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question because I do see this a lot also like in my own research when I talk to parents. It's interesting, a lot of parents do think that the one parent, one language strategy is the best way to go about this. But I think really increasingly we're seeing from the literature is that you should just do what you think works the most for whatever constellation of language is, present in your family, right? So if it's really hard for one parent to speak one language to the child and the other to speak, like you can mix. Sometimes both parents know how to speak both languages very well, so they end up like code switching. Sometimes the parents like don't understand the other parent's language. So let's say one parent speaks Italian as their mother tongue, one parent speaks French as their mother tongue, and they're mutually they both just speak English to each other. So that can be a bit like frustrating, right? If you have to speak to your child in Italian and then translate to your husband in French what you just said to the child, right? So I think you just have to do what works for you. I think what is just important, whatever way you end up doing this, whatever strategy you end up adopting and finding like is most suitable for your context. What's really important is that we know that the more kids are exposed to a language, the more like their language development is correlated to their language exposure, right? Yeah. So if you really want them to grow up kind of like bilingual, like equally speaking both languages, even though there's no such thing as like 100%, right? Like I said, it's not two monolinguals in one. Then it's good to try to make sure that they're getting, relatively equal amounts of time being exposed to both languages.
Correct. And would you say there's something like teaching kids too many languages? Do we know of like research where maybe kids are exposed to 5 languages and they've not done really well with that? Is there like a golden number that's good for them?
So again, I don't think there's like a, after 4 languages, you're done, or I don't think, but I do think that, like I said, there's like almost like an opportunity cost to borrow some of the vocabulary from economics. It's just that the more you're exposing them to languages, the more this time is like distributed across languages, right? So like you only have 24 hours in a day, right? So if you're only talking to your child like X number of hours per day, you're dividing those hours by all these languages, right? So of course they're gonna get like less exposure to the different syntactic structures, the vocabulary of the language, and even like communicative competence in these different languages, right? Because a lot of language learning is also like language socialization in some ways, right? You're not learning linguistic competence only, you're also learning the pragmatics of that language, right? So I think that's the trade-off, is that the more more languages you're teaching them, the less time they have with each language, and then it will get confusing if you're you're teaching a kid like that. But we know there are, even like in India, for example, we know there are a lot of kids that do grow up with like 3, 4, 5 languages, right? So it's not unheard of. I think it's just that most research on child development tends to come from Western contexts, and especially from the States. Actually, the United States is like, I think, the biggest producer of research on child development. And in the US, people do tend to grow up monolingual. There is a larger tendency for people to grow up monolingual or bilingual at most. Right. So I think it can sound like very, it's surprising when you hear of a kid like speaking 3 or 4 languages growing up, but I think, it happens and people do it and kids do it and it works.
Absolutely. And would you say because we know that babies have the ability to hear even when they're in the mother's womb.
Yeah.
And that's where the hearing develops and they start picking up unfamiliar sounds, at least, if not like voices, if not syntax. They do have that ability to pick up on sounds. And then gradually, as they're growing up, they start picking up on syntax, on like the beat, on the tone. They start recognizing
the prosody of the language.
Absolutely. Yeah. So is it beneficial for moms to talk a lot to their baby while they're pregnant? Like, do we know if that improves their language in any way? Is it just something that improves bonding, perhaps?
Yeah. So that's beyond my area of expertise, but I do know that like babies, they recognize who their caregiver is when they or their caregiver's voice, right? In the very first few weeks, they know who that is, especially if they've heard their mom in the womb, while they were in the womb. So I think, it doesn't hurt for sure to just like talk. And I think it is also something that moms just do, right? They just feel like they're creating this bond with the baby before the baby's even born, because, you feel like a mom before before your baby is right. Like the second you know you're pregnant, you almost like feel like, oh, there's some sort of connection there, and so they talk to the baby, and I think obviously that could be helpful. It's beneficial because they do hear.
Absolutely. Is there, like, when we talk about teaching kids language, is there a tool which you feel through maybe your research or maybe just in terms of whatever information we have now that's superior as compared to other tools? One, of course, is conversation and that constant serve and return. But in terms of the different tools we have, like storytelling or listening to like a television show, for example, listening to two people having a conversation as like a sideline.
Like overheard speech.
Yeah, just like overheard speech. Is either one of these tools more beneficial to teach kids language than others?
Yeah, so I think as with like most research on child development and parenting, I think it's really hard to pinpoint like one thing that it all boils down to, right? It's like really, it's really just an amalgamation of different elements and different factors, that kind of the interplay between all of those that influences how the child ends up their language development and their trajectory. I do think that a lot of research does point to the importance of, like, in addition to interactions, serve and return, conversational turn taking, the importance of storybook sharing and just like telling stories and reading books with children. That is very important because you do use more diverse vocabulary when you're doing this. You're exposing children to different sentence structures, more information. It's also nice because it helps develop their print literacy, and also they might like associate it with something like a positive moment, like that we're sitting with mom or we're sitting with dad, we're reading the story, and that kind of can develop their affinity for books later on, and it becomes like this virtuous cycle of reading and enjoying reading. That being said, I do think like it's important to just say these things, but also with like a little bit of caution when we say these things. Is like sometimes we give parents like advice on things to do, but it's not necessarily like these aren't causal, right? Like we know they're highly correlated, etc. But you can't just immediately assume that if you're reading to your child, then definitely this is by default going to lead to the child being like a bookworm when they grow up. And I say this like from anecdotal experience, not just with like my researcher hat on. But from anecdotal experience, I know, for example, my mom used to read for my sister and me when we were kids. And I was a bookworm par excellence. Like I used to just like, I was such an avid reader. I was always reading. You could always find my nose. And, like I was always just like reading the whole time, taking my books everywhere. And my sister really did not like, she had an aversion to books, and we were both raised by the same parents in the same household with the same number of books, which the number of books is also like in a house is also used as a predictor sometimes of like children's home literacy environment. So you ask parents like, how many children's books do you have at home? So I think, yes, like these can be predictors, but they're not, like immediate, like causal relations. So I would be wary of just like telling parents there's this like one thing that if you do it, that's the panacea. That's the thing that's your child's gonna be the next Shakespeare. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Because I think it's like a lot of different things that come in together, like also the child's, own like interests and all of that. So it could be a mix of both.
And then like peer experiences also somewhere along the way.
The non-shared environment.
Yeah. The child goes to school, learns something else and comes back and is like, sorry, I don't want to interact with books anymore.
Exactly. Or maybe they find something else that's interesting to them. And like that's the thing, the non-shared environment of siblings, for example. So yes, it's true. My sister and I grew up in the same house with the same resources, same parents, etc. But, we didn't have the same classmates, right? So, or we didn't have maybe the same teachers, or we didn't have so I think, there's other things that come into play. So I think it's just important to think of this as a very, like as a holistic kind of just look at the big picture and try to think of, okay, there are so many different elements in this. There are things that we know are helpful and beneficial, but it's great. They're helpful and beneficial kind of like in unison, right? Like it's not, you can't just do one thing and call it a day. Like you can't just read to your child 15 minutes before bed and then that's it, and you're like, all right, I'm done, I did that. You know what I mean? We're good. There are so many different things that you could be doing. I think that's the important thing.
Absolutely. And also different cultures have different parenting practices.
Absolutely.
Like reading to your child before bed is a very Western approach to putting your child to sleep, for example. Yeah. Like when I was a child, my dad would like tell us a story and that's how we went to sleep. We never like opened up a book and read it before bedtime.
Right.
We were just like told a story.
Like oral narrative.
Yeah, like he made up some story about this like person living in a jungle and that's a story we heard.
Like mustering all of his creative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But because every culture is so different in terms of how they raise children, so it's not, you can't, like, I completely agree with you. It's very, I think, partial to put it as a causal relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think you raise a great point, is that like different cultures have like different parenting styles, and even within the same cultures we find a lot of variation as well, right? So I think it's important also to not be very kind of like prescriptivist in terms of what we say that parents should do. I mean, obviously there are some universals, like things like corporal punishment is not, you shouldn't do that, things like that. But even things like how you read a book to the child, right? Like we know there are practices that are very beneficial for children's, lexical development and their their narrative skills, like the way they narrate stories afterwards. It's important if they see that kind of modeled by their parents. But even those like look different from one culture to another, right? Like for example, in Western cultures, like in the U.S., for example, when you tell a story, it's very linear. In some other cultures, it might be more like so. It varies, I think. So it's important not to just, sort of try. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I would avoid telling parents that there is like one key way to do things, and that's that's the.
Because I think it can't be prescriptive. With these things, we can't have it being prescriptive because perhaps what's there in like more Eastern countries is that there's a whole set of caregivers around one child. And in that, the child is getting so much constant interaction, which perhaps kids on this side of the world don't necessarily get because of how families are set
up.
So maybe in this kind of environment, it's more beneficial for parents to do that storytelling so kids have access. Whereas in like a more Eastern kind of family environment where there are multiple caregivers, the child is getting enough interaction.
Maybe he's hearing lots of stories all over.
Maybe to sleep he doesn't want to hear anything. He just wants to go to sleep.
By then he's like, my social battery is drained. I've heard too many stories today. I am done.
Exactly. Like, who knows?
Yeah.
And when you like research parents, do you think that there is a difference in how mothers versus fathers interact with kids, which then amounts to their language development, their cognitive abilities, all of that in the future?
So again, my research doesn't really look at differences between like moms or dads, right? I just look at parenting as a general, also because I think increasingly these categories are going to become a bit more outdated in a way because, before we used to just assume that the mother is the person that the child's spending the most time with. And the father is like away at work, but sometimes you see stay-at-home dads or maybe like working moms and working dads. So maybe we should start like, as you mentioned earlier, like introduce a third element, which is like the caregiver or the babysitter or whoever else the child's actually spending a lot of time with. And second, because there's also like same-sex families, right, where it might be two mothers or two fathers or two like two parents more generally. And so I think that these like kind of gendered roles of like mother, father are going to become like increasingly, I don't think we're gonna resort to that as much as the previous literature did, just because of like changing socioeconomic, broader factors in how the modern world is structured, I guess. But what I would say is that some prior research has shown that because fathers usually in that research, they come home and they play with their kids, right? Like that's what that's their time with their kids. So it does like help with children's vocabulary. It's predictive of children's vocabulary. They're engaging in these things. Whereas moms might like be more involved in the day-to-day. They have like broader, I guess, scope of activities that they're doing with the child, including routine activities like bath time or snack time or whatever. So it could be a little bit of that in that sense, but yeah.
That's so interesting. That like you said, I think our previous research was very narrow in terms of how it corresponds to the world today. There's just so many different changes in social statuses and social setups that I don't think we can easily translate what we knew then to what we know now.
Yeah, because exactly, I think the what's interesting as well is that there's this like seminal paper by Henrik and colleagues on how a lot of research in psychology is on Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. So what they call weird, like that acronym is weird, right? But it's interesting because not only do we now realize that the research from those countries, doesn't necessarily apply to other countries, right? Because there are different like cultural factors involved, but also I'm curious to see how research is going to evolve within those like weird countries. What kind of variables do we look at? What kind of structures do we look at? Because I think that, this idea of like a stay-at-home mom, a dad that is working, and then like 2 kids in the house, and then like a white picket fence and and a golden retriever, like that's not gonna, and a golden retriever is not gonna always be the the status quo, I think. And I think we're increasingly aware of the fact that this is not only not applicable to other cultures, but also within the same, like within the US or there are so many different types of families and so many different backgrounds and stuff that we should account for in our research, not only in terms of our research questions, but also in terms of our research design and how we operationalize our variables and all of that.
Absolutely. And as we think about the shifting of the world with like AI and all of that coming in, how do you think language acquisition, language development for kids is going to change?
Yeah.
Are they going to resort to a lot more AI tools to start learning language? I mean, what do you foreshadow happening?
Yeah, so again, I always feel like I need to start with the caveat that this is not my area of expertise, because I think these things they're developing so rapidly, right? That even like experts on AI kind of, there's this like black box problem. Like we don't know what's going on. So we don't know. I mean, I think my gut reaction is to be like, oh, but it's never going to replace human interaction, because it's so important to just talk to your parents, because your mom or your dad are going to be more able to give you these socially contingent responses. They're going to also be able to, be these like language socialization agents in your life, right? And there's going to be this social emotional element, right? Because there are social cues when you're talking to someone versus when you're reading off a screen or listening to like a robot, I guess. I don't know where we're going with this. But I don't know where AI is going. Like maybe it's going to become increasingly, responsive, and maybe it's going to become increasingly interactive, and maybe we're going to be able to, with things like deepfakes or whatever, like maybe you're going to be able to put like a very human looking face rather than just like an avatar, because I think we're already seeing a lot of that now, right? You have like Instagram influencers that are actually AI and people don't know, and they're commenting and they're like, oh, I love your outfit, and I'm like, you realize this is not a real person. So I think for children they might be even easier to kind of so I really don't know where we're going with that. I guess I'm a bit like partial to in-person interactions, and I hope that this remains something that is seen as valuable and important, for the parent-child bonds and the relationships and everything. But I do think we're probably going to see more, just the way we saw a lot more like iPad use, for example, with children, right? It's not, I mean, it has its advantages, of course, but it also has a lot of drawbacks when you're like leaving the kid with a screen. So I just hope that we're going to be responsible, I guess, in how we use AI in the future. And I think for that reason, it's super important to just, as quickly as we can, maybe start some sort of global task force. I don't know, just try to find a way to make sure that people have the literacy needed around AI to make sure that it's also like not harmful to children, because I do think it's becoming, incredibly powerful. Like, I don't know, from one day to the other, you see so many changes. It's insane. You talk to ChatGPT and it's like, oh my God, this is incredible. Like, how does this person?
And now it's like, oh, like, how was I living before this without ChatGPT?
Yeah, and it's so fast.
It's so fast, exactly.
It's so fast. Like that transformation it's just like how now we're like, I can't imagine my life without Google Maps, for example. I can't. Like I need it to function. And I'm always like, wow, I wonder how people navigated like 20 years ago, but they knew how to do it, right? Like it was fine. It's just that once these technologies become so ubiquitous and they're, omnipresent, you just become so used to them. And I think also a bit maybe unaware of any kind of like insidious effects that they could have.
Right, because like now we see like 2-year-old, 3-year-old kids who've just started learning how to speak, but they know how to converse with like
Alexa
or like a home gadget. Like they know how to say, hey Alexa, can you play? Like it's insane to think that a 3-year-old child has the understanding to say it, but they do, because I think this is again something that they learn from the environment around them. Maybe they've heard their parents use it.
They're modeling this to them.
Maybe they're just modeling it. But in that, they start experimenting with it and then understanding how it works.
Yeah. And then and it's interesting because then you wonder like, okay, how can I make sure that this AI is aware that the person that is talking to it is a child and doesn't give them the answers that, maybe because kids might be, I don't know. I think it's like it's important because as an adult, as a parent who cares about the child, I think there are ways in which you would navigate certain conversations. There are certain things that you wouldn't want to expose your children to at a very young age, maybe, etc. So I worry about this, like, making it super accessible where a child doesn't even need to know how to like type or write to ask a question.
That's so true.
So I think it can be a bit dangerous having so much access. To so
That's
many
so
things,
true, because now languages would not be filtered at all. At least in like social interactions, language is somewhere filtered.
Exactly.
No matter what language it is.
Exactly, absolutely, and you try to make sure you're not saying.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No. Exactly. So I don't know. I think I'm a bit. I don't want to sound like a Luddite, but like I am a bit a bit nervous. I think about I think there are going to be so many good uses, just like the way internet revolutionized our lives in a way, right? And it made it so much easier in some ways, but it also came with like a lot of dangerous aspects to it that we needed to kind of develop some sort of like literacy around to be able to make sure that children are safe online, safe with social media, etc. I think we need to make sure that we're on track for that.
Absolutely.
With AI as well.
Absolutely, because it's not even in terms of like getting access to wrong information, perhaps. That's like a second step. But I think the first step is also just getting access to like slang, which otherwise parents wouldn't teach their kids slang as like the first set of languages. You want to be sure that they're rich in like the good vocabulary before they start learning slang, which perhaps as a natural consequence kids start learning in school. But like if 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds are going to start picking up on slang through like Alexa and all of these gadgets around them, then I think that's going to really alter how people even talk to each other.
You think? I don't know. The thing is, I am all for, I kind of like slang, to be honest. I think I like having, like lots of repertoires that you can, just different kinds of language. I do think it takes a lot of intelligence as well, like social intelligence to know which one to use at which time. And kids, I think, are pretty good at this. And that's part of, again, like the language socialization process where they know, like, how do I speak to this person in this context about this topic? But I don't know. I don't think slang was my main concern. I think I was just worried more about what AI would tell kids. Like if you're asking kids questions, I don't know, because kids ask interesting questions, right? Or maybe they want to see certain things or whatever. I also wonder if AI can be mean. Can it be mean? I've never. I hope not. But I think probably not. But
I hope not.
But yeah, that's another thing. Like, what if you create an AI bully or whatever, right? Like, it's just, there are so many concerns, I think, that come up with.
That's so true. That's so true. And as like a little takeaway, if you had to summarize like the top 3 things that parents should know, or like top 5 things that parents should know about language development, what would you want that to be?
Oof. That's a good question. I think I should like end my dissertation with that. That's a good. I think the number one thing is to just definitely talk to your children, right? Even before the child can talk to them. Just because they're not talking doesn't mean they don't understand, right? Like, just talk to your child as early as possible. Number 2 would be enjoy it, right? Enjoy, like, don't make it. I think also, because that's another thing, is that we see that a lot, especially maybe in Western cultures a bit more, is that parents feel so much pressure to be like, I need to make sure that I'm ticking all the right boxes. I'm doing all these things that are important for my child's cognitive development. And I think that can be very stressful when you place the onus on parents that, it's almost like the child is a project, right? And I think that's a bit dangerous. I think, no, like, enjoy it. Like, I think motherhood, fatherhood, like parenthood is just a beautiful thing. And so I think, just enjoy the process, enjoy your conversations, look at what is like interesting to your child and talk a little bit more about that. And so I think that would be the second thing. And the third thing I would say is that, while we do, from research, we know, like, there's, obviously there's really, truly, the literature on language acquisition is incredible, right? It's, it's not a recent research topic. It's been going on for years. So there's a lot that the research can tell us. So it is important, of course, to read the research and, be informed, but also to try to think of how it applies to your own context, because I do think that families come in like very different shapes and sizes and, in different setups. And so I think that if something works for one family, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for you, and vice versa. And if it doesn't work for you, that doesn't make you, like a bad parent, right? Like, I guess it's just to just relax a little bit, because I do think there's a lot of pressure on parents lately, and it's become like almost like stressful for parents to parent, and it kind of like takes the fun out of, being a parent. And I think that's sad, because, I'm not saying you should be completely nonchalant and not, you should definitely, I mean, my research is on this, right? Like you should definitely try to stimulate your child and be there as a parent and be present and everything. But I also don't think you should do that at the expense of enjoying parenthood, because then, if you are, let's say, like hypothetically, you are reading to your child every day and you're using really diverse syntax, diverse sentences, diverse vocabulary, complex syntax, etc. But you're making it like a stressful thing for the child. You're like, it's time to read. Do you get this new word? Let's get this. I think that's just going to be stressful, and the child's going to be like, oh my God, it's time to read, rather than thinking like, oh great, it's, storybook time. So I think, there's pros and cons to taking it a bit too.
Absolutely. And stress like transpires. Children absorb it even if they don't hear it.
There is, right? Like the family stress model, right? Yeah. Like it is a thing, right? So it's not like, they know their mom is like freaking out about, storybook time, which is not great. You don't want your mom to just be stressed about reading a storybook to you because she wants to make sure she's like getting everything right. That, I think, just have a good time and it's going to be fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a pleasure.
Super
fun.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of From Birth to Bloom. I hope that you learned everything that I learned from Sandra. It was such an interesting conversation and truly eye-opening in the world of early childhood.